right, this is Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai, and I'm here again with Marcelo Guadiana. And today, we're going to continue our podcast series. This is episode 2, and we're going to really talk about take the systems theme, Marcelo, and really talk more about systems, how it applies to modern healthcare, and really focus on medicine and biology across East and West, because I think it's a great paradigm for really understanding systems. And I think in the last podcast, if you remember, I shared a little bit about in fact, I went deeply into my own background. And I think when you really look at systems thinking or systems theory, what this is really all about, that systems theory and systems thinking ultimately is really about enabling an individual to start finding truth. And truth, we're going to talk about this. It's a very interesting concept. It's called an emergent property. So truth is not something that you just come across because you just happen to know truth, you know?
Yeah.
There's all these spiritual concepts. I want to go into a very rational, I'm not saying I'm not against spirituality, but I think we want to get down to the fact that ultimately truth takes effort. Even if you take the spiritual perspective, it's not like be it Jesus or Buddha suddenly came across truth per se. They had to work at it in some sense. You know, they had to do their penance.
Yeah.
Or in the Hindu culture, you call your sadhana, which means you had to put some effort in. And I would say the most greatest truths, probably the most subtlest ones, take more effort. And we think truth is just supposed to be something you just get from watching CNN or Fox News or listening to an expert. And I think the real notion is that each one of us, from the sense of being truly human, has a capacity to know truth.
Yeah.
And that takes effort.
Is that similar to what Socrates says as well?
Well, I think the Socratic approach was asking questions and recognizing that you have to chip away, and truth emerges from that process of questioning. In a systems approach, what you're trying to do is not that dissimilar. You recognize that it's not the parts that are important, it's the interconnections between the things.
Yeah.
And the more you interconnect that, it's almost like something comes into focus. You imagine you looking at a very blurry picture in a microscope, and as you get the right focus, the actual image gets clear and truth emerges.
Yeah, I know exactly.
So it's called an emergent property. Yeah. So it requires integration. For me, for whatever reason, my life has always been forced to understand how to integrate things. It's sort of been forced upon me now. I grew up in Bombay. If anyone's been to Bombay, Bombay's sort of New York on steroids. If New York is a melting pot, Bombay's like an industrial furnace. You have hundreds of different languages, people of all different races, different castes, different religions, who live in a very small area. So you cannot not recognize that you have to get along and you have to learn how to integrate.
Yeah.
But I also grew up not only in Bombay, which was this a city within cities within cities, but I also grew up in a much more non-chaotic world, which was these villages in India. So at least 1/3 of my life was spent in a village where the scenes were, emerald greenery, coconut trees. I would take a caboose ride. We're not talking about the Amtrak in those days. It was actually, like the Wild West cabooses. And I'd be flying my little kite that I would make outside of the caboose train as a train is going. It's one of the most beautiful events because you're just going through all sorts of amazing countryside.
Yeah.
And you see all different kinds of people. But my grandparents lived in a deep South Indian village. And the scenes from that were, you have these, as I mentioned, these beautiful fields. You have dotted temples, typically workers, working in these fields. 87% of India, by the way, is rural, right? So it's a very small percentage of India, which is really urban. And my grandparents, as I shared with you, when they came back from Burma, they were always farmers. When they came back to India after World War II, or as World War II was going on, they went back into subsistence farming. So they would plant rice or cotton, all organic. There's no Monsanto at that time. These are, my grandmother would literally be out there planting individual seedlings. She'd come home with leeches on her feet. Same with my great-grandfather. So my earliest scenes were these very hardworking people. My great-grandfather, my grandmother, working the fields. On weekends, my grandmother practiced a system of Indian medicine known as Siddha, Siddha, which is known in the south. In the north, very similar principles was known as Ayurveda, Ayurveda. Siddha, by the way, if you think about it, it's almost the beginning of the word Siddhartha. So the Siddhars, as they were called, believed in enlightenment, and they actually had multiple branches of their system. One was martial arts. In fact, if you look at martial arts, most of the experts will say the original martial arts started in India.
Okay.
And then it spread. They also had herbs, a deep study of herbs. They had another study of heavy metals, believe it or not. They used metals, what we may consider toxic metals, but low dosages from plants, and learned how to do alchemy. They also had yoga, the postures, and they had meditation to achieve enlightenment.
Yeah.
But the Siddhars believed, or the Siddha system believed, that not only should you achieve spiritual enlightenment, but a manifestation of that was you could actually retain your body physically. That was part of mastery, that to not age. And they had a whole treatment called Kaya Kalpa, which is a treatment that you learn these arts of how to do that. So that was a Siddha system. Ayurveda, which is probably more known in the United States because some people brought it here, like Maharishi and then later other people. And that system was essentially the herbal piece and the yoga piece. But the point I'm making is that the Siddha, or the traditional Indian system, was these 5 branches.
So it incorporates everything.
It incorporates everything.
Where did the Siddha originate from, and like when?
So that's a good question. So the mythology is that Shiva, as I mentioned, the god of creation and destruction, passed on the knowledge of the Siddha system to his wife Parvati. And then Parvati passed it on to her son Murugan, or Karthikeyan. Murugan, remember, Shiva and Parvati had 2 sons. In the United States, everyone's familiar with the elephant god, the guy with the tusk, but he has a brother called Karthikeyan, who is also the god of war and the god of medicine. The story goes that in the Indian system, a warrior not only fights, goes to fight battle, but the real battle is against death. So that's what a Vaidya is called. A Vaidya is a warrior, but he's also a healer. So they're very interestingly integrated because you fight death.
Yeah.
So Shiva passed on the knowledge of Siddha to Parvati. Parvati passed it on to her son Murugan. And then the story goes, Murugan then dictated the teachings of Siddha to the first sage called Agastya. And he wrote them down in these palm leaf manuscripts, which were then transmitted orally, and then people kept replicating those manuscripts in poetry.
So this goes back thousands of years.
Well, so the language is called Tamil.
Yeah.
Most linguists will agree that Tamil is the oldest language on the planet. And we can do a podcast on that. But the point is that the Siddha was a system. And so my grandmother used to practice the system that she learned, not through she didn't go to a university or Votech school. It was passed on by various teachers in Burma and in India that she learned. So separate from doing farming, on weekends, if you went to her home, there'd be 30, 40 people lined up. She would observe their face, and based on observing their face, she could diagnose their particular constitution of their body. Now, there was a whole treatise written in the Siddha system called Samudrika Lakshanam. I'm telling you, so Lakshanam means face, and it's the art of face reading.
Yeah.
And there's, books and books written on this, or treatises.
Okay.
So the idea was, as above, so below. Everything is reflected in everything else. So in the Siddha system, you could understand someone's state by looking at their eyes. That's one method, or the tongue, but also the face. So she could observe the face, predict the particular dysfunctions in a person's body, as well as their base constitution. So you have the base constitution, who you are, and dysfunctions. And then she would formulate particular combinations of herbs that she knew. Sometimes she gave people particular massages or particular even yoga exercises. So everything was customized. You see, so even though you may have the same ailment, let's say some liver ailment, and I may have that, if we were different constitutions, we would get very different kinds of treatments.
Yeah.
So today, we call it precision medicine, the right medicine for the right person at the right time. Well, this is what the Indian system of medicine was always based on.
So is any type of is this used in modern medicine today at all? You think?
Well, so in India, if you have a health card, in India it's called Ayush, Ayush, which is a ministry in the Indian government. A for Ayurveda, Y for Yoga, U for Unani, which is a Middle Eastern version, S for Siddha, H for homeopathy. So you can go to these Ayush practitioners, in addition to what we call allopathic, traditional Western medicine.
Okay.
And so you can get both treatments from both sets of people that you're interested in. And so my grandmother was able to practice this. And, we can do a whole lecture or podcast on the Indian system of medicine. They didn't have the terms genes, proteins, disease. In the Indian system of medicine, all disease had one cure, which was food and nutrition.
Yeah.
All disease had one cure, which was food and nutrition. The notion was when you had imbalances in that's what causes disease. And they had the notion that all disease went through different stages, 6 stages. So in their writings, when they talked about disease, if you catch it in the early stage, you can fix it much sooner. In Western medicine, we typically seem to catch it in stage 5 or 6. And then we have to bombard it with chemotherapy or invasive treatments. So in that system of medicine, there was a whole language that they had. And that language not only was for the body, it went all the way to the beginning of creation. So they had a terminology which meant the body, that the universe had, at one point there was nothingness, unmanifest energy, which means nothing existed, which they called Purusha.
Okay.
And at a certain point, they put it in mythological terms, the creator god or aspect of Shiva wakes up, Brahma, and when he wakes up, that begins the universe. And that causes Prakriti, which is everything that is manifest. So you go from nothingness to manifest. And that manifestation has various levels. Initially, the subtleness is energy. And they had different flavors of that energy. 3 flavors, sattva, rajas, and tamas. Sattva was the energy of like saints, very light, airy. Tamas was much more heavy, like the energy of like criminals, if you want to think about it. And rajas were the energy of warriors.
Okay.
And then those energies then gave rise to physical matter, which they put into space, air, fire, water, and earth. They called it Panchabhutas, 5 elements. And those material bases gave rise to what they called the doshas, or the aspects of the body. Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. And you don't have to get into this. We'll do a whole podcast on this. And that Vata, Pitta, and Kapha, those 3 manifestations of matter, gave rise to the tissues in the body. 7 different tissues, which then gave rise to the body. And now in the Indian system, you not only had the mind, the brain, or the senses, but you also had another thing called chakras, which we in Western medicine don't understand. They called energy centers. And these energy centers were linked to different aspects of you, not only in the physical plane, but in other planes. So you can see it's integrated end to end. So this system, as I mentioned, it got passed on to these different sages throughout time, thousands of years. And the thing was, when people think about the Indian guru, they see the guy with long hair, a beard, and wearing some saffron robe. You got to understand, these people were modern scientists. In those days, they called them rishis. Many of these people were against religion. Siddhars were against religion, organized religion. They were into the scientific method. They believed you had to explore, and they were scientists.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask, if this was part of Hinduism as well.
Well, Hinduism, if you look at Hinduism, eliminate the H, it's Indus. It's the culture of the Indus Valley, because it was known as Indus, Indus. So Hinduism, believe it or not, is a completely disorganized, quote-unquote, religion.
Okay.
That's why it's very hard to understand what is Hinduism. You have thousands of different deities. You have all different ranges, but the core set of Siddha, Shaiva, Siddhanta, which is Shiva, this form of manifest and unmanifest energy, which has a material component, which were these teachings, which we can get into. There's a whole mythology, but ultimately it was a systems analysis of existence. And that's what these rishis were. And these rishis wrote down their stuff. They were very secretive to the extent they knew they had very powerful knowledge. So when they would pass it on, they passed it on in poetry. So we talk about cryptography. Their poetry was cryptography in the sense they had two messages in the poetry. One was, oh, that sounds, like a message about, some interesting, if you were to just read it as a message, it would sound like, oh, they're just talking about something very apparent, right? But then you had to be able to decipher it. For example, if you read Shakespeare, there's one way of reading it, and there's another way where you actually understand the meaning of it. Yeah. It's two meanings. Yeah. And the deeper meaning, you have to learn an art of how to decipher. But in that deeper meaning was the medical or the real knowledge of anti-aging, how to combine things, because they didn't want this to fall into people who are amateurs and would misuse their knowledge. And so there's hundreds of thousands of these palm manuscripts.
Well, like you're saying, you got to put effort into knowing truth.
You got to, so you have to decipher it. Yeah. Just like if you read Shakespeare, for example, if you see when Polonius tells his son Laertes in Hamlet's, to thy own self be true. Okay, sounds like, be true. But then what you really read, you look at the life of Polonius and Laertes. Polonius is a complete liar. So for Polonius to tell his son to thy own self be true, that conversation is really about hypocrisy. People speak one thing but do other things.
Yeah.
You see, but to the apparent thing, oh, isn't he saying something nice? So there was always this apparent language and then the reality, the superficial and the real.
Yeah, very analogous to politics nowadays.
Exactly. Right. But you have to have this wisdom to separate the words, what they meant. They may sound cool, to what they actually really meant.
Yeah.
But I'll give you an example. I may get the paraphrasing wrong. It says when you climb to the top of the mountain, you will get nectar. Okay? Well, the actual meaning of that, in the context, if you read it, is when you climb to the top of the mountain, in the body, they say the temple of God is within you. So the body, in the Indian tradition, the top of the mountain is your pineal gland, which is your third eye. When you meditate on that, the pineal gland actually releases melatonin, which is a secretion.
Also DMT, right?
Yeah, or DMT, etc. Yeah. But the point was, when you reach the top of the mountain, in fact, I think the original, you'll get a mango and you'll get, the syrup released from it. What it really meant is when you go to the top of your own mountain within you, you will release you'll be able to release melatonin, what we call it today,
yeah,
or the particular fluid, which actually allows you to have enlightenment. You see, so there's two meanings here.
Yeah.
So someone could say, oh, you just go to the top of a mountain and you achieve enlightenment. But what they were really talking about when you go to the mountain within you. So that's how and this was all written in Tamil. By the way, there's hundreds of thousands of these palm leaf manuscripts. And in 2007, the Indian government started funding it to actually start deciphering them.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, my the reason I bring this up is after I went through my 4 degrees at MIT, my PhD, I actually went back to India in 2007, as I mentioned, and I studied Siddha. I also, prior going to that, I had all this engineering training and biological training in the Western system. So the Indian tradition looked at that system had its own language, how they perceive the body, the world. Now, in the Western world, we look at the body as genes and proteins and metabolites and molecular pathways. So if you talk to a Western biologist, he doesn't, if you told him Purushan, Prakriti, and Vata, Pitta, he's going to think this is a bunch of witch doctor.
Yeah.
But if you told him in the language of, the pineal gland, is the center of the endocrine system and it releases melatonin, which is a master regulator, blah, 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 right? They get it, right? So you're looking at a language issue here. The Indian system of medicine had its own language. The Western system had its own language. So when I went back to India in 2007, I was very intent on seeing if I could bridge both these worlds, because my view is truth is truth is truth. You look at the body, we may have a certain language for describing it. The Indians may have a different word, but it's still the body, and we should still be able to decipher the same functions. In fact, they had a 5,000, 10,000-year-old head start we've only been doing this for about a couple hundred years, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Is there some things from their system that can really benefit us so we don't have to waste another 5,000 years?
Yeah, so the translation can get misinterpreted.
Exactly.
For
Right.
people to think it's all like bananas and like cuckoo. It's not really.
Exactly. So if you remember, the biggest thing, there's a stone, if you've been to the British Museum, called a Rosetta Stone. It's a great thing to go see. I don't know if you know what that is. You may have studied in history class. If you take European history, it talks about when Napoleon came across a Rosetta Stone.
Okay.
So there was Greece, Old Greek, and then there was hieroglyphics. And people never knew how to decipher hieroglyphics. I believe when they found this tablet, I may get this not precise, but on this tablet was a speech that Ptolemy had given. And that speech was in Greek, Old Greek, as well as in hieroglyphics. So we had, the Rosetta Stone was able to help us translate from hieroglyphics to Greek.
Okay.
So my goal was, could I figure out a Rosetta Stone to translate traditional systems of Indian medicine to the modern world? Because if we could do that, then we could have a window, because they had come up with them. So if you believe that they had amazing formulations, they could cure all sorts of illnesses. Do we want to spend 5,000 years to find cures when they may have actually found those, but in a different language?
Yeah.
So that was really my intent. And in fact, so I finished my PhD, and the front page of MIT, remember, I went back to do my PhD at the age of 40, because I'd done a company, and at 44, I got my PhD, and I go back to India.
What made you get back your PhD? Or go back to get
Because I was always interested in medicine.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
I'd been in and out, and I never liked Western medicine. But in 2003, when I went back to MIT to do my PhD, this new field called systems biology was coming, which we'll talk about.
Yeah.
And it was funny because up until then, Western biology was not systems-based. It was reductionist. Reductionism, we'll talk a lot about that versus a systems approach. Reductionism is looking at the parts of a problem, not the interconnections. So for example, if you go to a doctor today, ask any doctor, you have a headache? The entire medical system is incented to not address your body as a system. They'll say, oh, you have that headache. They'll give you one prescription to go see a therapist, another prescription for a headache, another prescription to go see an endocrinologist, another prescription maybe to see a neurologist, right? You may end up seeing 5 specialists.
Yeah.
Give you an idea, my dad plays a lot of Sudoku, and he uses iPhone. He's 85 years old. He's always bent over on his neck. So he was unable to swallow. So he goes to the ENT guy. Well, that guy just looks at his throat and says, oh, you have a throat issue, and tells him to do some exercises for his throat. Okay? Now, if he had breathing issues, the lung guy, luckily doesn't have it, the pulmonologist would say, oh, you have a breathing issue, take this and this and this. Okay? But when you really look at it, when you bend your neck over, and everyone should be thinking about this if you use a lot of iPhones, we're all hunched over. Yeah. What happens is, as you do that over and over again, you actually wear the frontal vertebral bone, C1, C2, C3.
Really?
And so that's what he's done. So he has no bone support there.
Wow.
So chiropractors know this. Some people don't like chiropractors, but chiropractors look at the body as a system. So what'll happen is he will not only have throat issues over time, he won't be able to swallow. He's also going to have breathing issues. But if you take a systems approach, you'll know it has to do with posture, and you have to address that, not just address the throat issue or the lung issue.
Yeah, so a chiropractor would actually fix that.
Well, chiropractors, by and large, are trained to look at the body as a system. They know the ankle bone's connected to the foot bone. Modern medicine is reductionist. You go to the doctor, you get triaged. And we'll talk about why.
Yeah. So, a doctor would never tell you, oh, do yoga or exercise.
Very rarely,
this,
right? Very rarely, right? They are taught, because of the healthcare system, it's to maximize the hospital visit. So the hospital, literally now, when you go there, they want to find as many specialists that you can go to.
That's to maximize profit.
To maximize profit.
Okay.
And also because if you look at the history of medicine, the system of modern medicine, you know where it came from?
After World War II, I believe, right?
Before that.
Okay.
But the key word used there was war.
Yeah.
Modern medicine is an outcome of war. And the real creator of the modern healthcare system was Florence Nightingale. in the 1800s, Crimean War is taking place. Florence Nightingale, she's been reduced probably for a lot of sexist reason that she's just a nurse.
Okay, American? Is she American?
No, Florence Nightingale was British,
okay.
right?
Oh, British, okay.
So Florence Nightingale, it's like when I was a kid, I used to love reading biographies. They said Florence Nightingale, this nurse who took care of soldiers. Florence Nightingale was a member of the Royal Society of Statistics. She was the mother of data visualization. She was a mother of big data. She was there out on the field, and she noticed something very peculiar with the data. Soldiers were fighting on the field, and they were not dying of being shot on the battleground. They were dying of untreated wounds when they came into the hospital. And she did this beautiful exploding pie chart where she showed that month over month over month as the war was going on, that soldiers were actually dying in the hospital. In the 1800s, you went to the hospital to die. There was no clean rooms and healthcare and nurses running around with white hats and doctors coming there to look at you. You went into the hospital to die.
So the wounds were getting infected.
Wounds were getting infected. So what Florence Nightingale did was she had this vision. She was looking 300 years into the future. She said, okay, let's make these hospitals, let's clean them up. Hygiene, the floors, the curtains. Then she said, okay, if we clean up the hospitals, then maybe doctors will come into the hospitals and look at these patients, and then maybe they will actually find medicines and do clinical research. So she had a vision, but the goal was at that time was you brought in a soldier, figure out what medicines you can give them to put them back on the field.
Yeah.
So it's a triage model. It wasn't about finding the underlying reason, like why war was taking place.
Yeah.
Soldier's arm is cut off. Let's treat that arm. Let's sew it back, right? And so Western medicine evolved from that crisis management model.
Yeah.
So it's excellent. God forbid something happen. Your arm does. A friend of mine, interesting guy. He used to work for Good Housekeeping magazine. He wrote like the book on how to take care of your lawnmower or your snowblower. Like don't stick your finger in and all that. Like the safety book. Ironically, he was using a snowblower and he cut his finger off. Okay.
Okay.
But the point was, modern medicine was able to sew that finger on beautifully, and he's fully recovered. So Western medicine is phenomenal for crisis situations, right?
I see, yeah, but not for all other things. Just for
It knows nothing about nutrition. It knows nothing about the body as an interconnected system. But God forbid, you need Botox, right? It's great for that. Your nose gets blown off. It'll put that back together, right? It's good.
Immediate results. That's
immediate crisis, Matt. After you've gotten cancer, when you've been eating horribly for 30 years of your life, it'll start bombarding it with chemo agents. It's basically cluster bombing, wartime, right? Attack the enemy. Yeah. It's that model of medicine. So, but Eastern systems of medicine, these yogis and these rishis would just sit out for 100 years sometimes, or 50 years, and just observe one little flower growing and make one observation, they record it, right? So they were more into looking at things over long periods of time and would extract some knowledge out of that. They would be out there eating different herbs and recording this stuff. These people were scientists. The Kama Sutra, which is the book of Indian sex, right? These people were sexual scientists. They would watch how animals screwed each other, this and that, and they would write all these down. So these guys were interesting characters. They were ultimate observers, but they did it over a long time span. They weren't into, I got to get that soldier back on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm not saying one is better than the other, just two different systems.
Yeah. Okay, I see.
So when I went back to India, it was funny that front page of the official MIT newspaper, front page article, it said Fulbright scholar on new adventure. Armed with 4 degrees, Shiva Ayyadurai heads back to India. So they found it sort of, why would this guy, after he got his amazing degrees at MIT, why does he want to go back to India, this quote-unquote third world country, and study this ancient form of medicine? So that's what I did when I went back to India. And my goal was to figure out, could I understand this Indian system of medicine and understand it from a Western perspective?
Yeah. That came from your grandma, right? And all the stories
right.
that you hear about.
Yeah, so my grandmother would tell me, and I saw her heal people.
Yeah.
So let's just take a little bit of, before we go, everyone uses the word system, right? The system is rigged, politicians say, right? The healthcare system, the transportation system. I mean, what other ways do we use the word system? The political system, right? We use system in many, many different, but what is a system? So let's really understand what is a system. Now, if you open the back of a watch, you'll see all these gears, right? That's a system. But it's not any one gear. A system is an interconnection of components from which something emerges which is bigger than any one component. That's what a system is.
Okay.
So a system is not any one part, but it's the interconnection of those parts when you put it together that something else emerges that is bigger than any one part. So for example, if you had 100 different little gears and you put them together, well, you could get a watch. If you put those gears together, you could probably get a motor, right? You could get something else. But it's how those components are put together, one yields a watch. Another system is if you and I shared this a lot in my course. I have this big picture of this very wild-looking thing, and I ask, "What is that?" And it's a space shuttle's engine. Typically, people don't know what it is. It's got millions of parts, right? But what emerges out of that is this thing that lets us take off the Earth's gravity, right?
So each part
is a small
could
piece.
be considered a system, or no?
Well, each part is a system.
Yeah, that's what.
But it's the interconnection of systems.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So everything could be reduced almost to a system. In
Right.
A way, but
Yeah. But so what matters is the interconnections.
yeah. Okay.
So the key was interconnections. If you were flying into LA or Boston, you look from the sky, you would see a system. You'd see the roadways, you'd see these lights, you'd see arteries, right? That too is a system. A city is a system.
Yeah.
If you were to go down to the microscopic level and you looked at a single cell, you'd see the nucleus, which is a system surrounded by a membrane, DNA, cytoplasm. That's a whole system, right? These are all systems.
So it's just recognizing the interconnected parts.
The interconnections, right? In engineering, like right now, people talk about AI. We're trying to put together pieces to mimic us as a human system. So the question is, do all systems have something in common? It's a very interesting question. So what's common about all these systems? And this is where I think we could start getting on the path to systems thinking. So if we start recognizing, regardless if you look at the human body, regardless if you look at a computer, regardless if you look at the solar system, regardless if you look at an ant, you look at this microphone I'm talking into, what is common about all these systems? And what you learn if you take a general systems theory course at MIT or in a science or an engineering course, and by the way, general systems theory is a field of engineering and science that came out in the 1930s. What you find out is every basic system, like the simplest system, has 5 components. An input, something goes into the system, something comes out of the system. So input and output, those are the 2 things. But then it has 3 other interesting components, which are called transport, conversion, and storage. What do I mean by that? So a system, when you send in the input, it transports, be it the information, the matter, or the energy. The input could be information, matter, or energy.
Okay.
So transport, there's some aspect of moving that through the system, movement. Another aspect of the system is conversion. So you have information, matter, or energy coming in, and it's converted into another form.
And there could be multiple stages of conversion.
Exactly. Yeah, so in our case, you eat a physical piece, an apple, goes down into your gut, so it moves down your esophagus, the aspect of movement, and your stomach, your small intestine digests that up. They convert it into glucose, which gives you energy, right? Matter gets converted into energy. Then it's stored. The third aspect of a system, or the fifth aspect, is storage. Somewhere it's stored. So you have input and output, transport, conversion, and storage. These are the fundamental aspects of a system, every basic system in the universe. I type in something into a keyboard, the input, the output, it shows up on the display. I open up a Word document I'm typing, right? You see the character show up, input and output. Well, the typing is transporting electrons into the system, which are then converted to ones and zeros, which appear as if you wrote hello world on the computer. And that you can save on the computer, right? Storage aspect, you can save it on the RAM or you can save it on the hard drive. You see? You look at any aspect of existence, you can apply these 5 principles. Anything. It's pretty deep. This may seem very simple, but it's quite deep.
Yeah.
So you take a generator, you know, The input to that is what? Fuel. Diesel generator. God forbid the lights go out in a building. You have diesel fuel, which is input, which is, by the way, stored in a thing. And then when the diesel generator starts up, it's transported into the engine, which converts that fuel into a rotational energy, which drives a mechanism where you can get electricity out of it. So matter is converted to electricity.
Yeah.
Got it? So input, output, transport, conversion, and storage. These are the elements of all basic systems. And you can apply this to anything. So a simple system is called an open system. I'll give you an example. You go to your home. Everyone uses this every day. When you walk into your home, what is that? Your light switch. You flip on the switch, and what does that do? It sends electricity, transports electricity through the wires, and when it hits the light bulb, the electricity is converted by the filaments into photons, so you get light. And that heat and that light are stored within that glass light bulb, right? I mean, the heat is stored in there, and the output you get is light.
Yeah.
Okay? A toaster. You put toast in, you press down the toaster, electricity goes in, and that electricity is transported and it's converted into the coils, which generates heat. It's typically stored for a temporary time in that casing until your toast heats up, and the output you get is you get a nice toasted piece, right? So this is input, output, transport, conversion, storage.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay? You could even think about it in a much more simpler way. You're sitting on the side of the street and you see an accident take place. Okay? So the input is these movement of matter, which is gets converted to images, transported through your retina. Phototransduction takes place. Those images get converted to images. I mean, the light get converted to images chemically and stored in your brain as an image. So think about that's a form of storage, and we all experience this. So input, output, transport, conversion, storage are the fundamental principles of every system.
Yeah, and then output would be your view or thoughts on what just happened.
Exactly.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. You interpret it in different ways.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, these are the 5 basic elements of all systems. Now, if you took another more advanced course at MIT, and I'm going to distill this down in the next 5 minutes, so you don't have to do that, you would learn what I just shared with you are basic systems, the 5 principles of every basic system. However, there are 4 additional principles which are the basis of intelligent systems. Intelligent systems. So there's quote-unquote dumb systems and smart systems.
So would that include humans, or is that what
We'll talk about that. So the issue is, what is intelligence? So for example, I'll give it to you. You're sitting on TV, Super Bowl game's going on, and you suddenly see a picture of a hamburger show up at McDonald's, right? And it's juicy, and they, marketers do this.
Yeah.
So there's transport. So the input is this image. They're transporting that to you. Your body now will convert that image, right? And it also will store it somewhere. But the response may be you run out, or you call, Uber, and you order McDonald's thing, right? Marketers survive on open systems. They want to hit you with an input and they want an output.
Okay. So that the open system is you can see what's happening, I guess.
Open system is it's just on or off. You send it thing in, you get an output. Input, output, input, output. Diesel generator is really, you put diesel fuel in and out comes electricity, right?
Yeah.
And people can be like this, what I would call dumb systems. We'll do a whole talk on AI on this. To me, that's really artificial intelligence, meaning you input something into a system and it reacts a certain way. It's just working on a set of algorithms. It's firing off instructions. It's not thinking.
Yeah.
So most human, a significant, I don't want to say most, but I think what makes a human being different is those people who are driven by input and output. And then there are people who use intelligence. And we're going to talk about what an intelligent system is.
Yeah.
Somewhat deep.
Do you think that that's worse than ever now with technology and the internet and social media? People just looking at something immediately. It triggers them, or they have to immediately response to get something. So people say for pleasure or satisfaction.
Right. So marketers know this. that I hit you with an input, I want you to get it. I don't want you to think, right? I want that information to flow to you. I want you to convert it in a certain way, and I want you to store that memory, right? And consumer packaged goods companies know this very well.
Yeah. And that probably started, like, really took off since the TV was created, right?
TV and Edward
50s.
Bernays' model of advertising.
Yeah.
Right? So advertisers know systems theory, whether they very good thriller or movie writers know systems theory. A lot of movies are formulaic. They know ... I do this, it's going to get this response out of you.
Yeah. So, like, looking at narration.
Exactly. Because it's a series of inputs.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about, so what is an intelligent system? What makes a system intelligent? And so in systems theory, one of the things you learn is control systems theory. And this was the era of cybernetics. There was a guy called Norbert Wiener. And Norbert Wiener is known as the father of cybernetics. Norbert Wiener, I think, went to MIT when he was 13 or 14, got his PhD when he was 17.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, after he really came up with the theory of robotics, cybernetics, AI, he then said that it was the worst thing because he became a Luddite to some extent. He said that it would destroy human labor. Norbert Wiener was one of the rare few scientists who would not work on the Manhattan Project out of MIT. Pretty much everyone else did.
Yeah, he saw the consequences.
He saw the consequences. He was a very interesting guy. But the notion of cybernetics or control systems theory was looking at intelligent systems. So if you have the basic system, which has those 5 elements, input, output, transport, conversion, and storage, right? You send an input, you get an output. So now the issue is, what is an intelligent system? And what an intelligent system has, 4 things. One of the key things an intelligent system has is a goal. It has its own goal. Now, we can argue where does that goal come from, which is a very deep philosophical discussion, but it has a goal. And what it does is, so we have the goal, and what it does is it has an ability to take the output of what is actually taking place within itself, sense it, actually look at it for what it truly is. It's called a sensor.
Okay.
And then it says, okay, my goal is this, but my senses are saying what I'm actually doing is this. So there's a difference between where I want to go and what I'm actually doing. Now I'm going to make a calculation. That's called a controller, or your mind makes a calculation saying, oh, if I keep doing what I'm doing, I'm going to keep heading in the wrong direction. So I'm going to correct myself, and it calculates a difference, and it sends a new input into itself. And that'll go through transport, conversion, storage to generate a new output. So it's a feedback system.
Yeah, so you're visualizing the end effect of your action.
Exactly. You're visualizing, I want to go in this direction. An example of this is an airplane. An airplane has an intelligent control system in it called the autopilot. Do you know that most airplanes are 99% of the times off course?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So if an airplane, you tell it to go from Boston to San Francisco, it's not like it's one straight shot, because the 4th element of an intelligent system is a disturbance. So the bottom line is that airplane, as I was saying, is off course 99% of the time. And so how does it stay on course? Because it is an intelligent system. So if you think about, as I mentioned, airplane going from Boston to Baltimore or Boston to San Francisco, choose a destination. The goal is a destination. And that goal is a particular longitude and latitude that you want to perfectly land at. Now, in order to go from Baltimore or Boston or wherever we start at to that destination, you're going to face all different kinds of disturbances. So think about when a plane is flying, it can have wind, storms, air, headwinds, right? Weather changes. These are all the disturbances that come in the way of that airplane reaching its destination. But in the midst of those disturbances, what the airplane does, it is constantly making adjustments to its system, monitoring the output, and constantly making small adjustments so it hits its goal. So if you look about it from a system standpoint, the airplane, from the basic system, the input is what to the system? It has multiple inputs in the case of the airplane. Fuel, right? it's making adjustments to the airplane wings, right, that give it height and lift and thrust. And then the output is it's on that heading to that location. But all those inputs that it gives affects the transport of fuel into the system, right, which the engines convert. Fuel is obviously stored. So that's a basic system. But the intelligence of the autopilot has a goal. I got to land at that location. So what it does is it has sensors. The airplane has sensors. Its altimeter, right? How fast it's growing. It has a bunch of sensors. Those are fed back into the controller, which says, I want to go here, and you know what? I'm off course. So it makes an adjustment. New inputs. Lower the speed, increase the speed, adjust the elevation, and it has a new output, right? And through this constant process, it finally hits its goal pretty amazingly dead on.
Yep.
But during that process, if you were to actually look at it carefully, it was probably 99% off course. It's constantly making adjustments. Another simple example everyone can understand a simple and intelligent system is a thermostat in a home, right? A thermostat is quite an intelligent system. The goal, I want to, in this home now, we want to, let's say, it's pretty hot, 78 degrees hot, but let's say you want to be 78 degrees. You're from India and you're in the winter time and you want nice and hot in your home. Well, in order to get to 78 degrees, you need to know where you're at right now. So you have a thermometer. So if you look at the thermostat in your home, it's got two things in here. One is a readout, which tells you what the actual temperature is because it's measuring it. And inside that thermometer is a wire that goes down to your heating system that tells it whether to turn on the furnace or to turn it off. Okay? So the way that works is, again, go to the basic system. In your living room, let's say you have a hot water heater. The input into that system is hot water that comes into that radiator. And that hot water heater radiates that hot water into thermal heat, which goes across a room.
Which is conversion. Which
is a conversion process. And down in your basement is a storage of that hot water, right? It's being stored. And on a need-by basis, that's pumping stuff through there. So, and you get the output of heat, right?
Yep.
But when you have a goal like 78 degrees, what happens is there's a sensor which is measuring the actual heat. It says, I want to hit 78 degrees. And there's typically what's called a controller, which is literally a valve, which tells how much, when to turn on the hot water and when to turn it off. That's why if you're in a home, you'll see the furnace going on and off, right? But if you actually look at that temperature, what's going on is you set it at 78 degrees. And let's say when you first start, the room is at like 70 degrees. The room will get to, let's say, 77, right? And the hot water heater will say, keep it on because I need to go up higher. Sometimes it'll go actually over. It'll overshoot. It'll go to 80 degrees and then it'll turn off. And then it'll come down. Maybe it'll go back to 77. It'll turn on. So my point is that in systems theory, it's not about perfection.
Yeah,
You're always hovering around the goal. And what's even more interesting from a philosophical standpoint is the better your sensor is and the better your controller is, it's not like you're going to go from 60 degrees to 90, back down to 60, back down to 90. You see, that's a very bad controller. But if you have a thermometer which only has 10 degree readings, you may do that. But if the thermometer has much more refined readings, you can measure 0.1 degrees. It'll be a very smooth transition. You'll be always around 78 degrees plus or minus 0.1 degree.
Yeah.
So what does that tell you? That tells you the sensors are important. Are you actually seeing things as they are? Because if not, you may be overshooting or undershooting your goal.
Yeah. So it's not a very rigid process or a very loose process. It's like in the middle, kind of, right?
What it is you're constantly making adjustments.
Yeah.
So now, the reason I'm bringing this up relative to the Indian concept, or in fact, want to go spiritually, what's happened with the world of spirituality is that people set a goal. I want to be an enlightened being, like in the New Age world. And then there's a guru. And he's telling you, you haven't achieved perfection yet. So you must give me more money. You must stay in my ashram and do whatever I want, whatever that is. You can, all the illicit things.
Yeah.
So there's control now by a guru. The person has given up his control because he's been sold this wrong bill of goods that the goal is perfection. No system ever hits perfectly 78 degrees. You're always hovering. So the goal is not about perfection. It's about constantly sensing and adjusting. And this is true in all life.
Yeah.
Right? That plane is 99% off. That's okay, though. But the important thing is it's constantly adjusting. So the issue comes down to, are we committed to our goal? And are we willing to go every day, every minute to constantly make those adjustments? Because in reality, intelligent control systems always live in the face of disturbances. So in summary, when you want to really look at this, what we're saying is that from a Western perspective, all systems, every basic system can be characterized by what? Input, output, transport, conversion, and storage. An intelligent system it has these four other elements: a goal, which it sets for itself. It has a sensor, which is able to observe, is it on track or not to its goal. It has a controller, which makes adjustments to the input to that system. But all of this is done in the face of disturbances. Because the reality is we all face disturbances each day. You want to achieve a certain weight. Let's say you're 200 pounds, you want to get down to 180. Well, think about so you've set a goal. First thing is, are you actually sensing yourself? Are you in the right mirror? Do you have a right weight scale? Because you don't want to have the weight scale misadjusted, because you may think you're doing well when you're not. So the sensor has to be right. Are you making the right decisions for yourself? If you want to get down from 200 to 180, what are the inputs you're putting into your system? Well, you're not going to get there by eating ice cream all day, right? You're not going to get there by eating garbage food. Yeah. You have to make the right inputs. And then you have to check the output, which means you have to have the right sensor. Anorexia is an example of where the person looking in the mirror has a bad sensor. They think that they're constantly fat when they're not.
Yeah. And
so that's a sensor issue.
In a way, influenced from society, right?
Right. Right. So all of these elements, we can get into deeper discussion. What influences them?
Yeah.
So this was the Indian system. This was the Western control systems theory. So basically, I've taught you probably 3 years of MIT in the last 15 minutes, but you have basically learned control systems theory.
Why does it take so long for them to teach this, you think? 3 years? I mean, a little bit too much.
There's a lot of reasons I have for this. First of all, there's not a incentive in academia to teach things in a shortened way. Think about, you go to college for 4 years. It's a money-making venture. My views are, I could probably distill the basic engineering education probably to less than 3 months. I would probably teach people linear algebra, control systems theory. You could do it but the issue is someone's come up with this business model of 4 years.
Yeah.
What I just taught you, this is a distillation of 20 years, and I'm proud of what I've been able to do is to distill this down and to break a lot of these rules that academics do not want to make it easy. Frankly, when I used to do scientific papers, right, if you read journal papers, sometimes they use big words and they make it purposely obfuscated. Yeah. I'm using that word purposely. It's a big sounding word. All that means is they make it confusing, because the idea is if you use bigger words and et cetera, you must be doing some great science.
Yeah.
Okay? There is a racket here. It's another podcast.
Yeah.
Now, so I basically taught you control. So I go to India and I'm trying to figure out what is this Indian system of medicine. And I was literally at an ashram, reading through ancient books, because a lot of this stuff in the Indian medicine, I had this aha moment. Because in the Indian system of medicine, remember I mentioned, you've probably heard of these words like karma, right?
Yeah.
You go to a yoga class, everyone says karma and namaste and all this stuff. But a lot of these people don't know what these words really mean. If I mentioned to you earlier, in the Indian system of medicine, they have vata, pitta, kapha. Yeah. So in the Indian system of medicine, when they look at your body, Marcelo, the first thing the Indian physician does is they characterize your body type. Oh, they say Marcelo has a lot of vata, a lot of pitta, a little bit of kapha. Or Shiva has a lot of vata, a lot of pitta, and not that much kapha. I may be similar to you.
Yeah.
Or someone else may be no vata, no pitta, a lot of kapha. So they are characterizing your body almost like a genotype.
Yeah.
And then based on that, they will tell you what foods you should eat. Now, here's a problem. You go to an Indian physician and you say, what is vata, pitta, kapha? I'm a Westerner. Explain it to me.
It sounds like mumbo jumbo.
It sounds like mumbo jumbo.
Like spiritual, like fake.
Exactly. Right. Like fake Indian. Like Elizabeth Warren. So they can't explain it.
Yeah.
Right? So therefore people walk away and say this is a bunch of nonsense.
Yeah,
The Western Even the open-minded Western physician says this is garbage. I can't understand it.
Yeah, I mean, you tell this to a doctor. If a doctor says this to a patient nowadays, like, it would be like, what are you telling me? Like, yeah.
Right. So Indians. So by the way, yoga now, 30 million people practice yoga in America. 36 million people. 1 out of every 10 people have felt yoga. Ayurveda, or Indian medicine, which was also brought to India around the same time, never took off. And my view is because no one understood this terminology, even though it has a lot of validity. So I had this aha moment. And what I said was, wait a minute. Vata, Pitta, and Kapha are the same as transport, conversion, and storage. And input and output are karma and karma fall. Okay, let me explain this. When you've heard of the word karma, what do you think it is?
If you do something bad, eventually it's gonna come back. But,
Right. So you sort of partially got it. You do something, something happens. Action, reaction. What karma really means is action.
Yeah.
If you look at the actual word of karma, it means action. And you can take right action or wrong action. Right input or wrong input. Now there's another word in Sanskrit called karma phal. Phal, P-H-A-L, is the fruits of karma. Fruits of your action. Does that sound like output?
Yeah.
So karma is input, what action you take. Karma follows the fruits of your input, which is your output. So the world of yoga and the world of medicine had been separated. So I said, wait a minute, karma and karma follow input and output, which comes from the world of Indian yoga, spiritual systems.
Yeah.
And Vata, Pitta, and Kapha are transport, conversion, storage. Because if you look at the Indian text, Vata is all those aspects of motion, movement. So in the Indian medicine system, they say he has having a Vata problem, could be a issue with transport, bowel. Okay? Pitta issues are related to digestion, conversion. Kapha issues are related to like structural issues or storage. Like if you have too much fat, storage.
Okay.
Okay? You're not storing memory right. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I was able to have this very interesting insight because I believe I looked at it from an engineering approach. And no one had ever written about this. So my conclusion was the basic systems if you look at the Indian terminology, was karma was input, karma fall was output, and Vata, Pitta, and Kapha were transport, conversion, storage. Now it gets even more interesting. So if you start studying Indian esoteric yoga, you find that there's 4 other terms: sankalpa, manas, indriyas, and vikaras. So sankalpa was the goal that a teacher would give to the student, or the student would discover for himself through their own practice. And it could be very simple. I don't want to get too esoteric about it. Basically, the goal could be I want to make a lot of money. The goal could be I want to lose weight. The goal could be I want to be a great journalist. The goal could be I want to be a great scientist. But it's the mission that you choose. It could be a mission for a few days, or it could be a mission for a year, it could be for a lifetime. So that was your goal. And you went through the process of understanding where you were at today, which is your karma fall, the actual state of where you're at. Like, what had all your actions brought you to today? And the way you assess your karma fall or your output was through your indriyas, your senses. You used your 5 senses, right? Smell, touch, etc., to understand where you were. And then you would use your mind, which was the manas, to make decisions to affect your karma, which is your actions. And all of this was done in the fate of different vikaras, disturbances. So if you think about spiritually, someone like Buddha, his purpose in life was to become an enlightened being. And if you look at it, he didn't suddenly just become an enlightened being. If you read like books like Hermann Hesse's Siddhartha, he went through a process. He made mistakes. You know, you go around this feedback process. He thought, the way I become an enlightened being is I should just become an ascetic. Go into the forest, put myself through penances, not eat anything, do all these harsh penances. So that was a karma he took on those actions. And what he found that the result of that was that he was just he thought he was better than others. He realized he was becoming more egotistical.
Okay.
But he was able to sense that. So then he took a different tack. He thought, maybe we should just be fully experience life, like be a lustful human being. So he went in that direction, right? Just like going from 68 degrees to 90 degrees.
Yeah.
And then through that process, he realized to have compassion for people, right? So he went through this iterative process, constantly making adjustments. in the midst of all of these disturbances. And then, it said the Buddha achieved enlightenment or nirvana, right? Now, that's a process we all go through. You want to stop smoking. That's your goal. Well, it's not going to happen overnight, but you have to have a commitment to that goal. So you're saying, okay, what's my karma fall, my apa? Well, I'm still smoking 20 packs a day. Okay, I'm going to go do some, I don't know, different type of meditation. Okay, now I'm at 2 packs a day. Oh, great, I'm heading in the right direction. Let me continue that. Well, that's now petered me out at 2. I'm going to have to add other things. Maybe I get, I don't know, a Nicorette patch. Maybe I add hypnosis. So you're sending different inputs into your system, and you're finding whether you're going to achieve that goal. Now you may have vikaras, disturbances. You have a bunch of friends who smoke all the time. Now you're back up to 20 packs a day. Well, you may decide, I may need to change my friends, right? So this is a process of intelligent systems. So what's fascinating is when I looked at this, and I laid them side by side, what I had realized, I discovered a Rosetta Stone, just like the stone which was able to decipher hieroglyphics. I was able to decipher the Indian system of medicine, which had karma, karmaphala, vata, pitta, kapha, sankalpa, manas, indriyas, vikaras. If I just told you that, you'd think this is some wacky new age, some weird witch doctor system of India. But if I told you karma is input, karmaphala is output, vata is transport, pitta is conversion, kapha is storage, sankalpa is goal, manas is controller, indriyas is sensor, and vikaras is disturbance. And I were to tell you that what the Indian rishis, scientists, were actually doing was viewing the entire world as a control system, as an intelligent system. And they had come to this conclusion because maybe they didn't know genes and atoms and proteins, but they realized that you needed to have a language for understanding complex systems. And that's what we do in engineering. In engineering, we use input, output, transport, conversion, storage, controller, sensor. This is how we built the space shuttle. This is how we get satellites up. This is how we build temperature. All the modern conveniences we have come from engineering systems theory. Yeah. And so the discovery I'd made was that across East and West, science and tradition, ancient and modern, was this common view of viewing the world as a system, and that intelligent systems had feedback control systems.
Yeah.
The words may have been different, but they were fundamentally the same. In fact, when I got back from India, I started teaching this as a course at MIT, where in a room I would have, I did it as a lecture series. On one side, I would have your traditional MDs, PhDs, engineering people. And on the other side, I had your yoga people. And typically they'd both come in and look at each other cross-eyed. But after I started teaching these concepts, I brought them to a common unity, an integrated view of the world.
Yeah. And that was your intent in doing this, right? In trying to
bridge these
Eastern
worlds
and Western medicine together.
But at a fundamental level, trying to bridge these worlds. Some people have used the word integrative medicine, but their integrative medicine has no integration. It's just a nice word. This was really a way to integrate both these worlds.
And the end goal being to create healthier humans.
Right? Well, one goal, see, what the real subtlety of all this is, I think the ancient people realized that there were these fundamental principles of all systems. And what they did was, and you have to listen carefully, is what they realized was, let's use the human body as a vehicle to understand these principles. So health would be a result, but that wasn't the end state. You were using your body as a lab to understand these things actually playing themselves out. You have action, you have results of action. You have transport of information, matter, and energy, transport vata. You have the conversion of things. You have the storage. You have goals. You have a mind which can make rational decisions.
Yeah.
But the idea was to use your body. Now, you would use your body to achieve health. But once you understood that, you could also understand how the planets worked, how the weather worked, because all of these were systems.
I see. Okay.
You see, so it's a very interesting thing. It wasn't just to get stuck at being narcissistic about taking care of the body. But using this approach was the beginning of understanding how to understand the world as a system.
And to not be stuck in that reductionist
Exactly.
mindset. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, the end result of this is the reason, I had finished my degree in systems biology at MIT in 2007, but I realized Western biology was finally coming to realize they needed to go non-reductionist. But they didn't really have a system. So my point was, look, the Indians actually had a systems biology. They called it Siddha and Ayurveda. So why don't we learn? But in that system, their whole notion was the right medicine for the right person at the right time. So which means a right input for the right system, because everyone had a different Vata, Pitta, Kapha. And it was timed because where were they in that process?
So it's like personalized for each one.
Personal precision medicine, we call it today.
And how did you, so you came back from India and you shared all this research and you started teaching class. What was the response?
Well, the response was people loved it. So I went to the head of this was in 2008-9 at that time. I came back and I went to the head of the department, Doug Laufenberger, and I said, look, Doug, I want to teach this as a course. And he said, well, I don't even know if people will be interested in this. But he goes, if more than 30 people show up, we'll do it as a lecture series. Then I will make it a course. We'll have to bring it up to the faculty. So we ended up having 100, 200 people show up, Marcelo, on a Thursday night for 3 hours. And I developed these series of classes. At the end of that semester, I went back to Doug Laufenberger and I said, Doug, look, here are the reviews. So they took it up to vote, and it was voted down 3-2. Because the traditional biological engineering department, which are from big pharma, they were concerned about this, right? Because I'm bringing a whole new way of looking at medicine. So anyway, I because I own the copyright materials to my own lectures, I converted that to a series I call Systems Health. And I started putting that in my own institute as a course. And the interesting thing was Deepak Chopra, who sort of came from India, tried to do the Ayurveda thing, didn't really take off. And then, but he loved my stuff, and I ended up selling my course at his events at $2,700 a pop. And he got jealous of me because he was losing revenue. Very interesting journey. So I ended up just doing it as my own course here in Cambridge. We took it online, and now we offer this essentially for nothing.
Yeah, okay.
And then if people want to get certified, we charge a couple $100, and they can actually teach it. So what I've done is my goal was to really convert this into a model to teach other people.
So did you get any pushback from doctors or biologists saying, this is all mumbo jumbo, like what are you teaching?
No, because I had taken a very solid approach. You see, everything's grounded. So that's what's powerful about this stuff. People, in fact, said, wow. Give you an example. There was the beginning of this year, there was a big meeting at Harvard Medical School. 1,500 of the physicians, Indian Ayurvedic people came, and I had 15 minutes standing ovation at the end of it. Because no one had seen someone really integrate this in a rational way. It becomes irrefutable because truth is truth.
Because this is grounded on the scientific method.
It's grounded on the scientific method. It's just the language is different.
Yeah.
The problem is the Indian gurus had taken advantage of the Indian people, putting the yellow robes instead of calling karma. Karma is basically action. So
in a way, you're kind of providing, I get more context or more of a holistic way of viewing things, but also applying it to lessons in life, not only in just making machines or it's also,
you can apply it to anything.
Yeah,
right. So I wrote a book called The Science of Everything, which I discuss this.
Okay.
And I wrote another book called System and Revolution, because what this does is it starts giving you an approach to look at and understand things in a deep way.
Yeah.
You start understanding that solutions come through integration or collaboration, through cooperation, and through combination. I call it the 3 C's. Collaboration, cooperation, combination.
Similar to what we were talking about the last episode, where you're saying real innovation came from you being allowed to innovate going in the lab and I guess decentralized way, right? It wasn't controlled from one guy telling you have to do this, you have to do that.
Exactly. It was the integration and collaboration of elements that wasn't part of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
It was a collaboration of a loving parent, a dedicated teacher, as well as a mentor. That's where innovation came from.
So you inventing email, like we talked about in the previous episode, was also based on this systems approach, right?
Yeah, if you fundamentally look at it, email itself is a system. It's not this reductionist thing of simply exchanging text messages. It was an entire system. And when people understand that it was a system, inbox, outbox, folders, had to have all of these interconnected components, and you needed all of those components to make it email. If you don't have an inbox, I'm sorry, you don't have email.
Yeah.
You have to, and if you don't have, you have to have the inbox, the outbox, the BCC. That's what makes email email. Simply exchanging text messages is not email. That's simply the exchange of text messages. I'm not claiming to have invented that. I created the integrated system, email as we know it. And what's even more important is the creation of that system took place in an integrative environment. And it wasn't driven by war.
Yeah.
It was driven by the desire to create. And it was done in an environment of collaboration, cooperation, and combination of multiple technologies. So that's what's fascinating. You know, what I've just shared with you, this integration of Eastern and Western medicine, again, took place because I was able to combine and bridge the worlds of Western systems theory to Indian Ayurveda and Siddha. And that is what I also invented into a new curriculum called Systems Health. And so, Systems Health, we're very proud of that because we're able to now take doctors and conventional people plus the woo-woo people and bring them together and actually give them both even deeper principles, which neither of them had, and also bridge those worlds. So part of, I think the important thing to understand is that the invention of email was not the only thing I did. It was sort of the beginning of my journey to invention and systems, Systems Health. We'll talk about EchoMail. But what I want to talk about, since we're on this thing about health, is CytoSolve. CytoSolve is one of my latest inventions that came out of my PhD work at MIT, but that too is based on a systems approach. And the problem we were trying to address there is, when my grandmother, looked at you and she understood your Vata, Pitta, Kapha, or your transport conversion stories, now that you understand that, she would figure out how you were disturbed when you were off balance, and she would try to make particular combinations for you. Now, the combination is the key. It wasn't just one medicine. Like if you get a inflammation today, people take Advil, ibuprofen. If you look at the back of ibuprofen, it's a single drug. It's a synthetic drug. You can't find that in nature. That molecule does not exist in nature. Yeah. In these systems of medicine, they combined natural compounds that exist in nature. And they put them together and they deliver it to you. When you have chai tea, it's a combination of multiple compounds. When you have curry at an Indian meal, it's a combination of herbs. But Western medicine doesn't know how to do combination. It's very good if you have a particular issue to get you back on the battlefield, right?
Yeah.
So if you have a headache or you have massive inflammation, boom, take Tylenol or Advil, and it does work.
And it doesn't necessarily look at the side effects.
It doesn't look at the side effects. It doesn't care because the goal is to get you back on the battlefield, get you back into work, get you back on the machine line so you can start working again. Now, the way they figure out, and we call that a compound, a synthetic compound. And this is distinguished from an herb, which is made up of many compounds. So it's a synthetic compound. So how do they do drug development? What is the system what is the current drug development system? Well, just to give you an idea, that system takes 13 years, about $5 billion. How does that work? So let's say, Marcelo, you are a scientist at MIT, and in your lab, you're working away for 10 years, and you're looking at this compound. One day, you find that this compound in a test tube of cancer cells kills those cancer cells. So that's the beginning. The day you discover that compound, you will go file a patent.
Yeah.
Now that patent, the day you file it, has a ticker on it, 20 years, until that patent is useless, meaning it goes public. So you're trying to take your compound and make it a drug, which means get it allowed by the Food and Drug Administration so others will consume it. Now, in order to do that, first you will do more test tube testing, which will take you another more years to validate it in fact works. If you make it through, that's called in vitro screening. If that works, then you'll go do animal testing, like in an actual animal, a rabbit, a mouse, monkey, whatever. And you'll kill a bunch of animals at different dosages. So you'll take that compound, what you're trying to figure out, how much can you give it that it actually works, let's say gets rid of the cancer, but doesn't give too much that it kills a person. So in drug development, you're working on two axes, toxicity and efficacy. You want to give enough that it's efficacious, but you don't want to give too much that it kills you.
Yeah.
Okay? So you'll do that in animals. All right? So that'll take another 3 years.
Oh, okay. That seems like a long process. Is that necessary?
Well, that's the current process. Yeah. Why do they do this? Because they really don't know what's actually going on when you take that compound.
Yeah.
They don't understand all the chemical reactions. You eat that, then what they're doing is you get the input, the karma, they're just looking at the karma fall. They're not looking at how it transports through, what is the conversion mechanisms, what's the storage. All those details are hidden. So they just do an input and they look at an output. Okay?
So even after they do this, like after 20, 13 years?
Well, this takes around 6 years. That's called preclinical testing. In a test tube and in an animal, it's called in vivo. Once you do that, you get data. Now you go to the FDA and you fill out what's called an IND, an investigational new drug. 2 to 5, 10,000 pieces of paperwork with lawyers, and you give them all this data. You say, hey, look, I've tested on animals. I think I've found the right dosage, and I'm ready to go to human testing. The FDA reviews that, 6, 7 months, and they say, okay, or not. I'm going to allow you, it's called an allowance, to go to human trials. That's called clinical trials.
And that's where they pay people to test.
Right. And those trials are phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 is a small set of human beings. Phase 2 is more. And phase 3 is a lot of people. You have to be successful in phase 1 to go to phase 2. Phase 2 to be successful in phase 3.
Yeah.
That may take another 9 years, 7 years.
How successful are people in that phase usually? Do a lot of people
It's a great question. So phase 1. So basically, if the FDA gives you allowance, now you can test on a small group of human beings. Only 20% of the things that ever go into phase 1 make it.
That kind of worries me for the humans that are testing these drugs. It's like, what happens to them?
Well,
after?
that's why they do it in third world countries, and
Oh, I didn't even know.
Yeah,
that. Okay.
yeah, right.
That's another.
It's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
So if it makes it phase 1, then they'll do it in phase 2 and phase 3. Now, what comes out of that is a single drug, a compound, and the FDA will allow it if it's efficacious and it's low toxicity, as long as you say all the side effects. That's why when you watch these shows on primetime TV, there's a drug and they say it works, but be aware this can happen, this can happen, this can happen. Your nose may fall off, your eyeballs can happen, but it will work to keep your beard on, right?
Mention it super fast.
Right. So, but the bottom line is, let's say that takes 13 years. But remember, patent life is what? 20 years. So now you have 7 years to recoup your investment. So if you spend $5 billion, and maybe the market for your drug is only 100,000 people, so you're going to have to price that drug at least at $50,000 to make your costs back.
Yeah.
$250,000 to make profit, operational costs, right? The reason the costs of drugs are high is, first of all, the development process is very costly.
Yeah.
And they have to be aware of liability. So the bottom line is, when I looked at this, I said, this doesn't make any sense, because it's all going into it like a black box. You give an input, you get an output. It's sort of dumb. You're not really understanding the control system here. So, and in fact, if from an engineering perspective, the way drug people work is, it's like you have a new design for an airplane. You don't really know how the airplane works. You throw the pilot in. If he fails, you say, shit, he died. If he succeeds, then later on you explain why that wing worked, like after the fact.
Yeah.
So it's not even rational drug development, it's rationalized drug development.
Yeah. And that airplane could be the human in a way, right? It's like it could go wrong and it's not.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, well, in this case, the airplane is the drug that you're testing. It's the design.
Okay, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Now, the reason this occurs is, again, if you peel away the system of research, well, let's look at the input, output, transport, conversion, storage, and the research system. Let's understand that. So academic research, if you're a researcher, what's the input you get? You need to get funding. And the output you get is you're supposed to produce papers.
Yeah.
And the more papers you produce, the more funding you get.
The more citations.
The more citations, etc. Yeah. And so if you're a researcher, it's like the story of Buddha tells about the king who brings the 6 blind men in. And there's an elephant. Each of the blind men is asked to touch the different parts of the elephant and tell what they see. So the guy who touches the tusk says he sees a spear. The guy who touches the head, the tusk, not the tusk, what is that thing called? Its nose.
Yeah, the nose. Yeah.
It says it's a snake. The guy touches its tail, says it's a rope, etc. Right? They all have their view. So if the elephant represented cancer, in academic medicine, people are touching the parts and they have their own viewpoint. It could be a blinded viewpoint.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter because the input in thing is get funding, transport your graduate students through, build up, store your archive of papers, and convert those papers into more funding.
Yeah.
Okay? That's the research model. And solving cancer and Alzheimer's, well, that's a secondary thought. And a lot of people don't know this. So the entire system is a very short-term perspective because once you get tenure, then you essentially have a job for life. So these academics do not work together. So if you and I are working in the two different labs in the same university and both get cancer funding, I'm not going to share my data with you because I want to win the Nobel Prize. I want to get my graduate students.
Yeah.
Right? So they don't collaborate. They don't cooperate. They don't integrate their research. Okay?
And that's how it's always been.
It's always been that because the incentive is to get funding, get your graduate students, win the Nobel Prize, and get your title at Harvard, right?
And even with medicine, it's the same thing.
Yeah, well, think about it, right? So the results of this are this. Today, if you look at the actual results, year over year, we spend 30% year over year in new R&D. Now, you would think if you spend more and more money every year, you should get 30% more and more new drugs. Well, the reality is, if you actually looked at the graph, we spend increase in spending in medical research, which we're actually finding less and less medicines. The system is broken.
Yeah.
This is what politicians don't know. They don't even talk about this. And that is what's resulting in high healthcare costs, a major part of it. The entire process of innovation is stuck on a bunch of academics who have made a racket out of research.
So it's basically they're not collaborating with each other, and they're looking at everything in a reductionist
way,
and
right?
In a holistic way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And they pretty
you
much
nailed
just
it.
like they need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
But the incentive is not there.
Yeah.
You see, so now go to the intelligence system. What is the goal of research? Is the goal of research to make sure XYZ professor wins a Nobel Prize? Or is the goal of research to make sure that we lower the cost of healthcare?
Yeah.
The goal of Harvard Medical School, I would argue, is not to solve the healthcare crisis. The goal of Harvard Medical School or MIT, is to get research dollars, billions coming in.
And the people involved, they almost know this as well, in a way, right? Do you think
they're caught in the racket? They know it. They know it quite well.
It's almost like someone looking at it like from a different perspective, saying, "Hey, why can't you guys just collaborate? These are human beings that are dying. Like these are like part of your people. You all can't get together and try to make like better innovations and solve everything together, right? You almost think like people would just step back and ask this basic question, but
right?
Well,
the reason is all of this is shrouded in a priesthood. It's like a religion, right? These are supposed to be the elites. We sure supposed to bow down to them. And so if you look at the journal, so if you and I are both, if you and I both join Harvard at the same time, we finished our PhDs, we got our first entry-level professorship. We have 7 years to get tenure. You and I are competing because maybe only one tenure professor job in biology. You're publishing your papers, I'm publishing my papers. After 7 years, what the committee looks at is not how many papers you publish, that's important, but how many other people cited your papers.
Yeah.
You may publish 100 papers, I may publish 100. I may publish one paper, but 1,000 people cite my work, but no one cites your work. Guess who's going to get tenure? I am.
Yeah.
Because I made a fundamental discovery. Or what's happened, this was the original notion, but what's happened now is people learn how to kiss ass. It's a kiss ass. So one guy may do amazing work, but he hasn't kissed ass. The other guy goes to all the parties, hangs out, whatever, and so he gets those people to cite his work.
Just because like they're buddies with them. Yeah.
Whatever, they have favors.
Yeah.
It's nepotism.
Yeah.
So what you have is journal papers. A guy called Randy Sheckman, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine, the few months or weeks after he won the Nobel Prize, he said, I'm not going to publish any more of the journals. He goes, it's all a racket. And he admitted, he confessed, the whole thing is a racket. So the point is that I've always felt you need a revolution in this. Yeah. As I shared with you before, the invention of email was a revolution. And as we talked about, when I started doing that work, it was about integrating computing and biology. Computers were one place, biologists were together. And so email was basically a way to integrate the entire interoffice mail system. So when I looked at this problem, I took a systems approach because email taught me about systems as a young kid. And the reason that I took this approach was because when you look at the human body and when you look at drug development, when you look at healthcare, they treat everything as parts in a reductionist way. So everything's incented to just study the part. And the biggest example of this is how people actually looked at the genome. Okay? Somewhere around the mid-90s, the failings of Western medicine or Western biology really started to appear. Up until, the discovery of DNA took place in the 1950s. In the 1990s, people said, let's sequence the human genome. Sequencing meaning that the genome, as you know, you have the double-stranded DNA helix, which we discovered in the 50s. And the theory was that if you look at DNA, pieces of the DNA are pieces of software programs coding for certain features. So one piece of DNA codes for your eye color. Another piece of DNA codes whether you can metabolize alcohol or not, like American Indians, Native Americans can't, right?
Okay.
Another piece of DNA says how long your nose is going to be, right? Etc. These are called genes. Now, at the time, we knew a worm had around 20,000 genes. So immediately, biologists assume, wow, a human being's far more complex than a worm. So they assumed, oh, we must have a lot more genes, right? So in the 1990s, people thought we had close to 500,000 genes before the Genome Project started. They had no idea of how many genes we had. But the assumption was, wow, we're more complex, so much more smarter than a little worm. We must have more genes, which means more parts.
And we have like more unique features.
More unique features, etc. But this assumption is based on what? A non-systems based approach of the body. More parts, more complexity.
Okay.
I'll repeat that again. More parts, more complexity. Right? Which means we knew a worm only had 20,000 genes. Human beings more complex, it must have a lot more genes.
Yeah.
You follow? But the irony of the Genome Project was that every year they went, so like for example in 1993, the count was only 80,000 genes. They said they brought it down from 500,000 to 80. Then they weren't finding then they reset the estimate to 50,000 genes in 1996, and in 2000 they reset it to 28. By the time the Genome Project ends in 2003, guess how many genes we have, Marcelo?
I'm guessing same as a worm, right?
We have the same number of genes, around 20,000 genes. In fact, plants have more genes than we do.
Really?
Yeah, because think about it. Plant has to stay still and it has to survive. The bottom line
you
is...
think it would have less because it's less complex.
Exactly. But so what this showed us was the number of parts is not related to complexity.
Okay.
So if I give you 5 balls, and I had 5 balls, right? Same number of balls, let's say, but I could interconnect them in very different ways. One way you could interconnect those 5 balls just in a linear sequence, just like a bunch of beads, one after the other. Another way is I could interconnect them in a circle. It's a little more complex. Another way is I could take 4 of them interconnected, put one in the center, and connected that, and then connect all of them.
Yeah.
Far more complex. So how you connect them is where complexity comes from. So what people realize is, remember, basic biology, which we can do another podcast on, genes give rise to proteins. Those proteins feed back, and they make all different reactions. So it's all these interconnections. So what makes us complex is not the number of genes, but all the interconnections between the genes and the proteins.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like, that's what makes us complex.
Yeah.
So those are called molecular pathways.
Okay.
So that led into a field called systems biology. So that's why I decided to come back to MIT in 2003. I always wanted to do medicine, but really hated this reductionism. And finally, I saw a little opening in Western science where people are saying, hey, something's wrong. If we want to understand the whole human being, it's not just the genes. We have to connect the genes to the proteins, the cells, the organs. We have to do an interconnected approach. Systems biology.
Yeah.
And at that same time in 2003, a big challenge took place by the National Science Foundation, which was, could you mathematically model the whole human cell? So what we were doing was saying, okay, if you take basic biology of the cell outside has a big membrane, like a wall, like a border wall. Inside of it is a cytoplasm where all the reactions take place.
Yeah.
And inside of the cytoplasm is a nucleus where the DNA sits. So up until 2003, we had thought there's a center to the cell. Like everything is about DNA, the centralized concept of biology. DNA is the king, and the king tells all the subjects what to do, all the other molecules.
But like we were saying, it's the interaction between the proteins
Exactly.
that really matter.
Right. So it's the interaction between the DNA, turns out, is storage. The cytoplasm is where conversion takes place, the reactions, like the big soup. And then the edge of the cell is where all the transport takes place. Things are going in and out.
Yeah.
Okay? Transport, conversion, and storage also occur in the cell. So the issue is DNA is not everything. We had put this very much like the organizational model. Oh, the CEO's office is everything. Or a notion that the central government is everything. Or the academics at MIT and Harvard are the smart people. They're the brains, and they tell everyone else to do.
And that's where quote-unquote innovation comes from, right?
That's right. That's where innovation comes from. So what it turns out is DNA is merely storage of a program. But that doesn't mean you're going to be just because of your DNA.
Yeah.
So it turns out it's the reactions. So the issue was, suppose we could mathematically understand all the reactions for any type of disease or for the whole cell. Imagine if we could map out all those chemical reactions biochemically, convert them into equations and model them, then theoretically we could model very complex reactions. Like we could model cancer on the computer. We could model Alzheimer's long before we did the test tube testing, long before we killed a bunch of animals, long before we even bothered testing on humans. And by the way, to give you an analogy, this is how we build airplanes, right? We don't build airplanes in anywhere in the world anymore by just throwing a test pilot in. We have the computer, we understand the physics, we can model the wind and everything, and then if someone comes up with a new design, we do it on the computer. If it breaks and all, we're not going to even bother building a model of it. If it works, then we go build a model, we do it in a wind tunnel, and then we go build it and we test pilots. So my theory was, suppose I could build a new technology that could mathematically model complex functions, like the whole cell.
Is this getting into AI and medicine, or do you think, in a way, or no?
It is. It uses aspects of AI, but it even uses something even more better than AI. AI is always based on correlations. We'll do another talk on it, but this is actually based on the mechanistic understanding. It's better than AI. Okay? In some sense, and I'll explain that in another talk. It's too deep to get into right now.
Yeah.
But the point is that over those 4 years back at MIT, I created a new technology, a new systems technology, that can look at a body of literature, let's say Alzheimer's. So let's say there's 20,000 papers written on Alzheimer's. If you read any of those papers, you will see each of those papers give, like the blind man, a little piece of the discovery. They'll say, oh, Alzheimer's is caused by this chemical reacting with this chemical to get this chemical, and they'll publish that. Someone else may have another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So what we're able to do with CytoSolve is look at the literature, extract out the papers that are relevant, okay? Then from that, extract out the little molecular pieces, and then interconnect them together. So what we're not saying it's perfect, but based on the known science, we're able to take all those blind men's little pieces of views and bring them together.
Yeah, you're starting the foundation almost for it to grow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's an architecture.
Yeah.
So we call it a systems architecture of disease.
So this was your goal from the very start.
Very start.
It is, I want to do this, and then you start getting into the coding.
Exactly.
Of it. Yeah.
Right. So this was a goal. Then I wrote the software code, just like I wrote the software code for email. I started writing the software code for CytoSolve. So if email was the electronic version of the entire interoffice mail system, CytoSolve was a way to model the entire intermolecular communication system. So what we were able to do was create an infrastructure or a technology that I could look at any disease, understand the different pieces, and build a framework for interconnecting that together. That was CytoSolve.
How hard was it to do that?
It took 4 or 5 years of coding.
I'm guessing a lot of disturbances.
A lot of disturbances.
Yeah.
So the disturbance you had was when I put my committee together, we had some professors saying, you can't do this. This is impossible to do. Very much like when I created email, right? Because many of those professors were either from the biology or computer science. Very few of them had worked in you see, when I built another company called EchoMail, we were integrating for large companies their multiple subsystems. And that's the way I saw this at. The problem with academics is they are 99% of them are on a linear path. They get their PhD, they do their undergraduate, then they do their master's and their PhD. They rarely ever have to ever go make something, build a company.
Yeah.
So when I came back from working, I was in and out. My advisor said, don't talk about your entrepreneurial efforts because they'll poo-poo it. Because there's a thing saying those who can't do, teach.
Yeah.
Okay? So there's this elitism that if you've been out in the world of entrepreneurism and building stuff, therefore you're less of an academic. Okay? So, but the reality was that after I built CytoSolve, then I spent more years playing their game and I published to validate it. There's a lot of publications I did. And I was able to show that our technology could take a physical phenomenon, mathematically model it, and it could match the actual data that we were getting. And then I went on to do many, many different examples with industry, with major pharma companies.
So this was revolutionary, right?
So completely revolutionary, because people thought this was impossible, just like the military-industrial complex thought email was impossible.
So what was your conclusion when you actually finished it? Like, was there this huge epiphany of like, oh my God?
Well, I knew this is what I wanted to. Yeah, so to me, like it was not an epiphany. It was like excitement, because after 40 some odd years, I'd fulfilled what I wanted to see what my grandmother did, right?
Yeah.
I had basically created a way. My grandmother did those combinations using her approach. I was able to basically create now a system that could model a disease, and I could then I could not only model that disease, and I could test different ingredients on the computer. Because you cannot do it the old-fashioned way. One ingredient, one compound takes 15 years. Now, if you want to do 10 compounds, you can't do it. You'd have to kill millions of animals.
Yeah.
So CytoSolve is a whole new way to eliminate animal testing, to discover new medicines. In fact, so I could go back to those ancient palm leaf scripts and look at what they said in combination and test it on CytoSolve.
Yeah.
Okay? So we published lots of papers during 2007 to 12. And in 2012, I spun CytoSolve off as a new company to commercialize it.
So what was the initial reaction, going back again, from the whole medical world of
well, the medical world is interesting, right? And I don't really care what they think, because they're a dead dinosaur. They're headed into their own oblivion, the pharmaceutical industry. But here's the opportunity. You see, the pharmaceutical industry is very good at building really good facilities. They have good clean rooms, etc. So what you see happening right now is people don't want to take drugs, right, that cause side effects. But albeit sometimes you need those drugs if you're in a late stage, like if you get your head blown off and you're in massive pain. I'm not going to tell people don't take pain because that's in that wartime situation. Yeah. But if you're a healthy person, you want to eat well, that's not going to help you. CytoSolve can actually model like cancer. We can model Alzheimer's and figure out what combinations of foods you should take to prevent Alzheimer's. And it can also help both sides.
Yeah.
So what's happening is the pharmaceutical world can benefit from us to develop better medicines that don't have side effects without killing so many animals.
And faster as well, right?
And faster. In fact, we discovered a drug for pancreatic cancer in a record 11 months and got it allowed by the FDA.
11 months. And what do you think it would have taken if you didn't use CytoSolve?
I don't know. It's far more longer than 11 months, years,
Yeah.
My point is that we have major companies. A multi-billion-dollar company recently used CytoSolve. They were in the middle of animal testing. They were unsure whether they should even go to clinical trials because they didn't really know what was going on. And they gave us a recent press release basically saying their animal data matched our in silico data, because now we know why their stuff is working.
Yeah.
So we've helped major nutraceutical companies figure out why their products work. We're helping a number of companies actually build products that actually work. If you go on the flip side, forget the pharma, a lot of the supplements at Whole Foods are all snake oil. No one even knows if they work. We are helping companies who want to build products that work really create products. So what CytoSolve is going to do, it's going to eliminate the garbage. It's going to help us build multi-combination therapies. In fact, 3 years ago, a paper came out in Nature, one of the most eminent science magazines in the Western scientific community, saying that if you're going to solve cancer, you have to use combination therapy. You can't just use a single drug, like cocktails. But they said if you try to do cocktails, it'll take forever. And my thesis was the only one cited in that paper. Now, by the way, I don't even know these guys as the only technology. So based on that paper, we raised about $1 million. And we said, why don't we take on pancreatic cancer? And we went through the 252 drugs that were out for cancer. And we started combining them on the computer, millions of combinations.
All the papers and combining.
Yeah. Well, actually, we tested different drug combinations because you would have had to kill millions of animals to do that. And we found a combination that did better than the gold standard, and we got it allowed by the FDA. And then we went to MD Anderson.
It almost seems like CytoSolve is taking a life of its own as long as people keep on producing papers and showing all the molecular activity of different drugs, right?
Well, what CytoSolve does is CytoSolve lets us look at a snapshot of science today, mathematically understand that, because we're bringing it together. We're the glue. We're the orchestra conductor. We're like the choreographer versus these people don't want to. We're like the systems guys. We bring it together. Once we bring it together at that point in time, we can understand, okay, this is how Alzheimer's is working. We're not saying we're perfect because as new science comes, we can keep augmenting, getting it better and better and better.
Yeah.
But based on what we know, we could start testing in silico, not in vitro in a test tube, not in vivo in an animal, but on the computer long before we waste time in a test tube, long before.
Yeah. So
we
that's
can,
what in silico means.
in
computer.
silico means on the computer, like silicon,
Yeah.
right? So that's how we're able to help pharmaceuticals. But similarly, in the Eastern world, if you go to Whole Foods right now, you'll find people make combinations of supplements for inflammation, like if your hand is hurting, right? So people combine like curcumin, which is the active ingredient in turmeric, or resveratrol, which is the active ingredient of the grapes, right? Red wine grapes, or the skin of grapes.
Yeah.
So it's been shown that both of these are anti-inflammatory. But if you combine them together, how much should you put together? So if you go ask like at Whole Foods, well, how come this has 20 milligrams, this 30? Everyone says, oh, blah, blah, blah. They hand wave. Oh, you should just trust us. Nice labeling. We're new age people. We care for you. Yeah. You have the other bamboozling that goes on the other side. But what CytoSolve is able to do is we've actually been able to take the molecular pathways of inflammation, mathematically model it, do different dosages of curcumin and turmeric, and actually figure out what are the right dosages that give the maximal effect on lowering inflammation. You see, so we can do on the computer what people are hand waving on.
Yeah, and you're also, I guess, like exposing all the side effects that people might have not known if maybe they didn't use CytoSolve, right?
Yeah, so we can predict stuff.
Yeah,
we can predict. Hey, this could also occur. These are the toxicities.
Yeah.
So bottom line, when I went to work for that medical school in 1977-78, I went there to actually do medical research. Because I could program, I was diverted to create email.
Just because they asked you if you
Just
could
because
create,
they asked me, right? And I took that on
funny.
as a challenge. I came to MIT in and out of there, wanting to do medical research, was diverted into engineering. Ended up again doing Echo Mail, which was an email analysis system, which we grew to a $250 million company. And then in 2003, I was finally able to pursue my dream, which was medicine, because this new field called systems biology, because finally the Western world said, hey, we have to take a systems approach. Now, the value of CytoSolve is not only for helping develop drugs faster, not only for helping figure out, like what my grandmother, combinations of nutraceuticals, functional foods, like we're going to be able to build supplements at work for athletes, for dogs, for canines, for animals. We're already doing this. It's not theory. But the other thing is CytoSolve is a scientific source of truth. So I'll give you, this final example. About in 2014, I was walking down the halls of MIT. MIT Technology Review is one of the most eminent science magazines in the world. In fact, in 2000, I was featured on the front page for inventing Echo Mail, a product, right, for automatic AI for email. But in 2014, I saw this article which said, "Buy fresh, buy GMO." Think about that. It was a front page article on the front page of the most eminent science magazine, Buy Fresh. I'm looking at this. I had to take a double take. because it was almost making fun of the buy fresh, buy local movement.
Yeah.
And as you read this article, it's almost the white man's burden model, which is saying that the poor darkies in India and Africa, they need GMOs. They make this argument. So we have to,
I've heard that argument.
we need genetic engineering.
Yeah.
To me, it's Bill Gates trying to be the neo-messianic, neo-missionary model. You see, India had massive diversity of crops. Africa's had massive diversity of crops. They were eating quite well before we came and we destroyed their soil base and reduced their diversity. That's when now you have these babies with the big fat stomachs and therefore they need us. We need to help the Ethiopians, blah, 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 blah. Right? So that's what this article is talking about. And I said something doesn't make sense here. So I started saying, what about if we could use CytoSolve to really understand what happens when you do genetic engineering? So what is genetic engineering? Genetic engineering is where you take the genome of a gene from one organism and you implant it into the genome of another organism. Now, this would never occur in nature. It occurs only in a lab.
Yeah.
So, by the way, stupid people at eminent, quote unquote, eminent newspapers like the New York Times, where for 10 years before we did this research, we're saying, oh, genetic engineering is no different than plant breeding, which has been done for thousands of years. You see, people used to do breeding of corn or breeding of animals. All we're doing is accelerating that. Well, big difference. When you do breeding of animals or breeding of corn, it's full sexual reproduction, right? You're literally taking corn plants and pollen. It's full sexual reproduction.
It's male and female. That's what
but it's not in a test tube.
Yeah. Okay.
A salmon never mates with a tomato, or a flounder never mates with a tomato. When you take the gene of a flounder, which has good, protective skin for cold, and you put it in a tomato to make it more, that would never occur in nature.
Yeah.
That's not plant breeding. I'm sorry.
It's like a pig. I don't know, like having sex with like a cow or something, right? It's like
Well, worse than that. A pig having sex with a corn.
Yeah.
Okay, it doesn't occur.
Yeah.
So for years, companies like Monsanto were saying, a genetically engineered soy. By the way, soy is 97% of the soy in the United States is genetically engineered. Only 3% is organic. Don't worry, a genetic engineered soy is exactly the same as an organic plant. How were they able to do this? Well, the way they were able to do this was in 1976, there was a policy called substantial equivalence passed by the U.S. government to support medical innovation. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're a medical innovator and you make a stethoscope. And it took you 7 years to get that stethoscope passed through the FDA. It's a new innovation. Now let's say you made one little change, like itsy-weeny change, like you just changed the color of the stethoscope, or some minor change like the earpiece change. Well, in the old FDA laws, you would have to go through another 7 years.
Yeah.
But in 1976, Gerald Ford signed a guideline called substantial equivalence, saying that if you as a manufacturer, if you could show that your new stethoscope was substantially equivalent, then you could fast track it. In 1 year, you could get approval. So substantial equivalence meant you get to choose whatever the criteria were, and you could show the equivalence.
The equivalence of
the new stethoscope with the old stethoscope.
Okay,
if you could say, hey, look, only they're pretty equivalent.
Yeah.
Okay. It had some reasonable rationale. Now, fast forward to around 2000, when Obama's in office, genetically engineered foods are coming. They say, wow, what it should be the guidance for a genetically engineered food going to the public. Michael Taylor, who was a former head of science policy at Monsanto, was appointed by Obama to be the deputy director of the FDA.
Yeah, which is ridiculous.
So he pulled substantial equivalence, which was done for medical devices, which are far less complex than a cell, which has billions of parts. Okay, billions of interconnections. And he said, let's use substantial equivalence. It was a guideline. So what that meant was if you and I wanted to make a genetically engineered blueberry, we simply tell the FDA, hey, we've looked at the genetically engineered blueberry. We've compared these parameters, the color of the blueberry, the amount of water content, fat content, and how large it is. We can make up whatever criteria we want, and we have found it to be substantially equivalent plus or 20%. And we simply inform the FDA.
By how much percent?
Plus or minus 20%.
Okay.
And the FDA will say, thank you, Shiva, and it's called a safety consultation letter. The FDA actually has a hands-on view. They don't want to get involved. And then we don't actually have to do that. We don't even, in fact, have to show the FDA any results. We just have to tell them we did something. And then you have the right to take that blueberry to market.
Really? So in other words,
there is no safety assessment standards.
Yeah.
But we are told that all the safe there. So when I looked at this problem, I said, why don't I use CytoSolve? Why don't I actually try to find out what are the mechanistic mechanisms? So I use CytoSolve to model the mechanisms of all plants. All plants have a metabolic pathway, like an engine, a systems engine that that takes carbon and it converts it to a process for fuel, to keep it simple. And that system consists of methionine biosynthesis, methylation, and formaldehyde detoxification. You don't have to get complicated. Think about it as 3 gears that work together, okay? But 2 of the gears actually create formaldehyde in the plant, which is a carcinogen.
Yeah.
And the plant, by the way, has a way to detoxify it through the 3rd gear called formaldehyde detoxification, and it uses an antioxidant called glutathione. So bottom line is, we published a paper showing how in a normal plant, how normal plants work, and we showed in a normal plant formaldehyde is created, but it gets detoxed because it has enough glutathione. Published that in a 2nd paper. A 3rd paper, we showed that when plants undergo stress, like during pollution or during drought, the plant actually will use up its glutathione because it's under stress, and formaldehyde will accumulate. Published that. No one said anything. Then in the 4th paper, we found some fascinating data showing when Monsanto, for soy, did the genetic engineering of soy, we found 5 different things were perturbed, 5 molecules. When we plug that into the model, guess what we find out? We find out the plant, the genetically engineered plant, is actually under the same kind of stress as when it's under drought conditions. And it actually will deplete its glutathione and will have much less glutathione.
What does that mean?
Which means the plant's under stress.
Yeah.
So imagine it's basically under constant stress.
What does that mean for the human body, though?
Well,
Okay.
Let's just look at the plant first of all. Bottom line, we showed that the genetically engineered soy plant has 250% less glutathione than the organic soy plant. So that means if glutathione had been the true marker of equivalence, soy would never have been allowed in the market.
But
they don't use that. So we did a real systems analysis, and we found out, because see, remember, they're able to choose whatever criteria they want.
Yeah, so
but
say if the grape is this size or this
exactly,
much
but
fat, they say,
it's like the
that's-
chicken.
yeah.
It's like the fox running the hen house.
And were people aware of this?
No, they weren't. It was fundamentally new research. We published it in journals, and then we get attacked by a guy called Kevin Folta, the head of the horticultural department at University of Florida.
What year is this?
This is in 2015. Okay? 14, 15. Okay? 15. So he attacks me.
For what is he saying?
He's saying you didn't invent email. He didn't attack any of the science.
Unrelated.
And he says, he goes, this guy didn't invent email. And he never attacked. And he says, oh, this is just a mathematical model. It doesn't mean anything. And then he goes on to say, Kevin Folta, that, by the way, I'm an independent scientist. I'm dedicated to science. I just want the truth. And I don't get paid off by Monsanto. So luckily, we published a 5th paper. We had found a research group in London, Leeds, in the United Kingdom, had actually grown the soy plant in a greenhouse. And they had come up with the same results, 250% less glutathione. And while we were publishing that paper, a FOIA...
So that supported your...
Yes,
your
supported our models, which means our models were showing them... A FOIA was done on Kevin Folta. FOIA means Freedom of Information Act, because he is part of the University of Florida, which is a state federally funded university.
Okay.
4,000 emails were released. And one of the emails is a letter from Monsanto to him giving him $25,000 to be their spokesman. Wow. And that finally appears on the front page of the New York Times.
Did you do the FOIA?
No, one of our, someone else we did. It was just God doing his coincidental work, because I believe this happens.
Yeah.
So Folta's been completely discredited. Our models match, and we've basically shown this. So, but the European Commission doesn't want to accept our results because Europe wants to support Monsanto still. Okay? when we've shown the system biology base. They can't ignore it.
But in America, they do accept it here. Right?
Well, it's the point is we've shown the rock solid science, but science is a religion, right? Yep. My point is that they have. So we had Michael, one of our my co-researcher on this was Michael Hansen. Michael Hansen is one of the most respected scientists, and Michael's backed us up on this. In fact, this paper, when this got out, Pierce Brosnan, who is a very famous Hollywood actor, 007, produced a movie called Poisoning Paradise. It's about how Monsanto and other companies have destroyed the island of Kauai, one of the beautiful islands.
It recently came out, right?
Yeah, and his wife is an investigative journalist. I ended up becoming the main scientist in that movie because of this research work. My point is this: CytoSolve is a technology that can find the source of scientific truth. So we have conclusively shown, for example, our model showed that organic soy would have about 9.9 levels of glutathione. The Roundup soy would have 3.7 levels. And that's what they found in the actual research that they did in London, physically growing it. So my point is, mathematical modeling can work.
Yeah.
You know?
What's the effect on humans, right?
So here's the thing. The same process that plants use to do C1 metabolism is the same thing in your gut bacteria. Okay? So, and they have found that pieces of the DNA strands in your gut bacteria. The point is, before I go speculate that, the real issue is, I think I want to close this podcast, so we have to take a systems approach. So if you look at nature as a grand engineer, nature went through billions and billions of years to create that soy plant. And it's a complex system, like the gears in the back or the space shuttle of the back of a watch. Everything has been finely tuned. Now you're telling me some guy at Monsanto saying he can just go throw in something in that finely tuned engine and it's not going to have any effect.
Bypass
a little titsy weeny teeny without understanding the system dynamics. CytoSolve helps us understand the system dynamics. And it says if you're going to do that thing, it's going to have this consequence. So I'm not pro or anti-GMO. We can get there, but even if I were to give them their thing, I'm not pro or anti. Let me take that position. But what I am conclusive is there are no safety assessment standards for genetically engineered foods.
And they're avoiding all this?
And these are very fragile systems.
In reality, they're avoiding this evidence because of profit, right? That's what it comes down to.
Well, yeah. So the real reason they're avoiding it, they have a racket. Yeah. Monsanto, after Vietnam War, they had created Agent Orange, which they created with Dow, which was an herbicide, which when you drop from the planes would kill all the trees so they could see the enemy. When Vietnam ended, remember, the military-industrial complex creates stuff for war, and then they try to resuscitate it for civilian use. So let's follow this carefully.
Just because it's convenient.
To make a secondary money.
Yeah, that's what I mean. For them, like they can make more money.
Exactly. So they created this ability. It's a complex technology. You deliver through the air an herbicide to kill foliage. Well, after Vietnam ended, they had this technology. Said, okay, let's use it for factory farms.
Yeah.
Drop stuff, and we'll kill the weeds that are growing around the soy. And they dominated that. So every farmer had to buy Roundup, also known as glyphosate.
And that's where they forced everyone
to buy their weed killer.
Yeah.
But now that weed killer was also killing the soy plants. So what they then did was they genetically engineered their own version of a soy plant, which could withstand glyphosate, their herbicide. So now what they did was, on the one hand, they monopolized the weed killer market. Now they're destroying the soil. They basically devastated the soil of the topsoil of the United States. And then they go saying, okay, now if you want to get higher yield, you have to buy our soy, which can withstand our herbicide and only kill the weeds. So now they force the farmers to also buy their soy plant.
Yeah.
And if that soy seed lands on someone else's, they'll go charge them. Now, the point I'm making here, the bigger systems point here, is that the racket here, and it comes back to our first podcast on email, is this. The military-industrial complex creates stuff for war. And then they try to repurpose that innovation for civilian life. But with email, they have a major problem. The problem is the inventor of email is alive. And I didn't create email for war. It was created for a civilian application. to help the secretary.
Yeah.
They wrote a false story trying to say that email was created for military communication, now want to get a trophy for saying we brought it back to civilian life. That's why the invention of email is so devastating to the military-industrial complex. Because the truth is, they typically create stuff for military and then resurrect it for civilian life to make their secondary income when it doesn't, in fact, it's not even useful.
Yeah.
You see, their text messaging is frankly useless. They didn't create email. They created text messaging, which is good for text messaging. But if you look at, for example, the Haber process, many wars ago, I think World War I or II, they created a way to fixate nitrogen, which created trinitrotoluene, TNT. Fixate nitrogen, that's bombs. Well, and it was called the Haber process. When they did that, they created a chemical innovation to make weaponry. Well, but it was actually nitrogen fixation technology. Well, when the war ended, they said, well, what do we do with this? Oh, let's fixate nitrogen to make fertilizer. Secondary market. And they forced the quote-unquote green revolution on everyone. For centuries, people in India and Africa were farming without fertilizer. They knew how to keep the microorganisms in the soil. They did crop rotation. They had very luscious soil. So these guys used a military technology and then did PR, the green revolution. All the darkies need the green revolution. And shoved that, and they sold fertilizer, nitrogen fixation. You see? So it goes from war to civilian, and then they create and they shove down stuff in the civilian world that's not needed.
Yeah. Okay.
And then they layer one military tech. So they did nitrogen fixation, then they did then they did herbicides, Agent Orange, then they did genetic engineering, which was done for biological warfare. You see?
Yeah.
But the invention of email shows you don't need war to create innovation. That you can actually go the right way. That innovation actually occurs when you want to solve a civilian problem. What I'm trying to do with CytoSolve is to solve a civilian problem. Why are we killing so many animals?
Yeah.
Why did my grandmother be able to come up with these things without having to go to Harvard Medical School? And how she helped a lot of people. So the motivation for innovation does not need to be war. The motivation for innovation is about everyday people looking at a problem and solving that problem. So CytoSolve is a solution for a problem of an ordinary woman in a village, how she was doing it. And what I'm able to do in the modern world is to understand those mechanisms. Email was trying to help ordinary people, a secretary, go from the typewriter to the keyboard. The military-industrial complex and the academic elites always want to subvert this natural process and impose their wartime process. And in that process, they want to brainwash all of us that they are the source of all innovation.
And that's the status quo in a way, right?
That's the status quo.
What you're providing is revolutionary, right?
Right.
It's a completely different system.
The common thing between email and CytoSolve, it's decentralized.
Yeah.
Email is decentralized. The military wanted hierarchical centralized messaging. CytoSolve is decentralized. We're saying, let's work with all these researchers, and CytoSolve is a vehicle for collaboration and cooperation. That's what email was.
Yeah, it really makes me think how much more we could get done if everything was based on a collaborative effort and it wasn't based on war and switching the innovation from war to human life, which I think we should have like a term because this is like a process. I
call it a collaboratory.
Okay.
So war is based on command and control. Think about war, centralized command and control. That's what they call it. Command and control, DEFCON, whatever. We have this place in the middle of the, mountain. Command and control.
Don't question your mission.
Don't question. You do this, you do this, you do this, right? Well, CytoSolve is based on, because what happens in all this research is one guy at Harvard thinks he's a master of Alzheimer's research. If a new research is done by some young postdoc at some state university, his may never get published. We're saying we're going to find that guy and we're going to bring it all together.
Yeah.
Right? Email was about decentralization. CytoSolve is about decentralization. But what Google and Facebook want to do is now centralize email.
Yeah.
You see? So it's fundamentally, I think we really get the richness for human endeavors when we go into cooperation, and then you pointed out decentralization. And that's ultimately what this comes down to. Innovation can occur anytime, any place, by anybody. That's what email shows. CytoSolve shows that we can cure many diseases, and it should be personalized for the individual. but again, taking a decentralized approach, period. So anyway, I think that's pretty good for this podcast. We've gone from email to CytoSolve. Hopefully people have learned systems. I think the next episode will continue this, perhaps talk about AI.
Yeah, definitely.